Boss fights. A concept that has become so ingrained in the gaming medium that the term could mean a variety of things. Throughout different genres, there have been different types of boss fights that fit a specific type of game. You have the traditional melee combat game where the bosses are stronger, more complex versions of the normal enemies, but then you look at a platformer like Crash Bandicoot 4. The focus of the boss fight is within the identity of the game. Boss fights in a game should strive to challenge the player's mastery of the mechanics and whatever they've learned so far. This is why boss fights are way more meaningful in some genres than others. Take shooting games. These games are based around the sandbox and enemy design. But when it comes to boss fights, the mechanics usually take a backseat in exchange for something more flashy. But then, you also have to take into account the narrative weight and presentation. So you look back and you genuinely cannot call this boring. Like, don't ever call this boring, please. But then again, these shallow mechanics are going to be distracting to some degree, which is why designing the boss fight around the game's mechanics will always be superior. So with all that in mind, let's now go through the boss fights in Halo. Halo is an ever-changing franchise where each game is very different from the last, and throughout the campaigns there have been different principles in implementing boss fights. Some Halos completely neglected them and others took a very different design approach to them where I don't even think they're boss fights anymore. Scarabs are more like encounters where you have to fight the Covenant, kind of like the ship in Halo 4. We're also not including the so-called mini-bosses like Hunters or the Enforcers from Halo 2. To me, in order for a boss fight to be a boss fight, the level design has to put a real emphasis on the boss. But yeah guys, before we get into this, I want to say that the Halo games don't actually need boss fights to make or break them. This is just a fun little analysis. So let's go! Halo 2 was the first Halo game to have boss fights. And here's where design comes into play. I cannot come up with one logical implementation of a boss fight in Halo Combat Evolved, because it just does not seem like that type of game. But what separates Halo 2 from Halo Combat Evolved? The narrative. In contrast to the simplicity of the Covenant in Halo 1, Halo 2 gave them so much depth and with that created a load of characters that would inevitably cross paths with the player. And Bungie, being a good game developer, obviously wasn't going to let these things happen in a cutscene.
I think Tartarus is someone who you really will, at the beginning, trust a little bit, but then end up loathing, and I think putting a bullet in his head is going to be extremely satisfying for people.
Undoubtably, the strongest part of Halo 2's boss fights are their narrative weight. The bosses aren't just random nobodies, they actually have a crucial place in the story, so when you kill them, it means something. And on top of that, they are great characters that you, the player, are invested in. Let's look at the first boss fight in the game. Immediately, the game does not introduce him like a cartoon villain, but instead as a being with a goal that he believes in. But of course, in a world of war and violence, he's not going to be overly peaceful.
Come out so we may kill you. Get in line.
And then, of course, you have this super compelling situation where he knows Thelvadamy and all he's done for the Covenant, so he doesn't believe that he's capable of changing. And by the end of the game, you really have to think, damn, what could have been? But how's the actual boss fight? Well, it's completely fucking horseshit until it isn't. And that's actually true for all the boss fights in the game except for maybe Tartarus, but basically, if you don't know the right approach, you are going to get fucking annihilated. And you might be thinking, well, Legendary's bullshit anyway, but the fact is that Bungie decided to change the actual boss fight in accordance to the difficulty, which means that if you don't play it on Legendary, the boss fight won't have stages. So basically, the key to this heretic boss fight is to hide, turn on active camo, kill one of the holograms hoping it's real, and then go back into hiding. It's of course easier said than done, but it's not really that difficult once you get the hang of it. Now that could be because I'm Halo man in real life, but it's also because of the checkpoints. I do not like the fact that there's checkpoints in these boss fights. The phases themselves are pretty short, so by the end of it, you don't really get much out of it. Sometimes it's fine to put checkpoints in your boss fights, but it's always better to not have them at all. So let's talk about the Regret boss fight. I remember doing this with my friend and Jesus, it was hard. Borderline impossible. There were so many enemies and we died so many times, and coming back to it by myself, it was a cakewalk. I pretty much just kept platforming to him until I killed him. It didn't even feel like there were that many enemies. So my opinion on these two boss fights is that they're good. Yes, they don't feature the most traditional Halo gameplay, but they don't really hinder the game in any way. I think the problem here is that they don't have enough presence. For one, they feel really short and they don't give you enough time to appreciate the artistry. But the same can't be said for the third and final boss fight, Tartarus. The boss fight is actually decently long and you don't have checkpoints for each phase, But the problem here is that it really wasn't well thought out. The entire boss fight was based around Johnson having to land 3 beam rifle shots for you to be able to do any damage. And while I don't think it's as annoying as a lot of people say, it leads to most of the fight consisting of you just exploiting the Tartarus AI. However, in each new phase, new brutes come in, which can kill you very easily because it is on legendary, so you have to be on top of that. But honestly, in contrast to what Joe Staten said, it wasn't that satisfying to take him down because of how much you have to rely on RNG Johnson. Grouping up all the Halo 2 boss fights, I really would say that they were untapped potential. The boss fights were still pretty enjoyable, and it's a great thing that they even decided to do them, but they obviously could have been a lot more realized. So after Halo 2, Bungie would surprisingly not do anything with Halo 3. Obviously they had that gimmick Guilty Spark moment, but no truth boss fight? Not even an attempt to expand on what Halo 2 did? Then with Halo 3 ODST and Halo Reach, I see why there wouldn't be any boss fights because those games didn't even have any real antagonist characters. And then Halo 4 was just a slap in the face, like what the fuck? They honestly shouldn't have even included a quick time event because it's like they thought we would actually feel anything if we pressed buttons in a fucking cutscene. Halo 4, in my opinion, is one of the most well-written Halo games, and with the Didact, who admittedly you do have to watch the terminals to get his character, but he was well-written. And to not have a boss fight, it's like, whatever, dude. Halo 4 has the worst campaign gameplay in the series anyways. Halo 5 did have boss fights, but not the ones we actually wanted. They had a Jewel and Dama boss fight because of how much he was set up in Halo 4, but then we literally watch a cutscene of Fireteam Osiris just fucking playing the level for us. Like, there's nothing here that we couldn't have just done in gameplay. It's just a normal ass enemy encounter. Like, I'm not saying that a Jewel and Dama boss fight would have been the craziest thing ever, but just let us fucking fight Joel. Like, it's such a simple thing that they just didn't do for no reason. And then the second non-existent boss fight is Master Chief, or Spartan Locke. Not only was this the entire marketing campaign and set up throughout the entire game, but this was such a shitty trash-ass cutscene. I've been saying this for years now, but I'm done getting mad over Halo 5. This cutscene just has so much wrong with it, but it's not even worth talking about anymore. On one hand, programming a Spartan enemy, let alone boss fight, does seem complicated in contrast to Jewel, who just had to be a goddamn elite, but this was the entire marketing for this game and they just didn't even try. So what did they do? This boss fight is actually not bad. The reason people don't like him is because Halo 5's story is shit, and also because he shows up quite a bit throughout the campaign, leading people to think he might be repetitive, which are completely valid criticisms, even though I thought it was fine, and he does shake up the combat well. Honestly, he acts more like a mini-boss in gameplay because the game never actually puts full focus on him. There is this part where it's like 3 wardens, and like I said, he is fun to fight. Halo 5's advanced movement makes it effective to dodge his attacks, and he has that weak spot on his back. His character being so shallow and the amount of times he shows up makes him less impactful as a boss fight. But I don't think you can say that he isn't a boss fight because he clearly has to be.
You should kill yourself now!
So now let's talk about Warzone, and by extension, Warzone Firefight. This game one has a bunch of bosses, but the thing is, I don't really think they count. They aren't dynamic encounters and instead are more like huge objectives that were meant to be taken down by like 8 players. Now I'm not saying that you're supposed to just mindlessly unload on them, but pretty much the only way to take down the bosses in the later rounds is to just have a group of tanks and other high-powered vehicles. The bosses basically consist of tanked up normal enemies, tanked up wardens, tanked up vehicles, and they did introduce the Grunt Goblin, which is great, but it's sad that you never really get to fight it like a normal enemy because it's just way too strong. These are objectively boss fights, but they're not even in campaign, and they serve a completely different purpose to what I'm talking about. But for what they are, they could be better, but they work well. So to sum up Halo 5, it definitely had a lot of bosses, but the role of the boss was never really fulfilled. The bosses did serve a purpose, but it was never in line with the traditional boss fight sequence in game design. The Warden served more of like a hunter or enforcer role, and the Warzone bosses were more like Destiny raid bosses. And now we arrive to the clapped prodigy, Halo Infinite. This game clearly put the most focus on actual boss fights, and there's a lot to unpack here. Now we have to accept that most of Halo Infinite's boss fights are just beefed up versions of enemies. This is very true for pretty much every boss in the open world, but also a lot for the in-level boss fights. And it's not just the fact that they're similar in design, but also narratively. Tremonius is a brute who talked to Eshtram and got orders to kill Master Chief. And that's essentially the same characterization that every single other brute in the game has. Then you look at Chaklock, and he's like,
Welcome to my tower, Master Chief. It is where you will be broken.
like, oh, okay, that's awesome. And then he's just a normal ass elite. And this no characterization problem even plagues the main villains in this game. I think it's common knowledge at this point that Halo Infinite has shitty villains, and that's because of the bad writing and also the fact that we still don't know what the Banished are even doing. Jaeger is a former Silent Shadow elite with black armor. That's it. And what does he say to Master Chief before the boss fight? You will die. Okay.
The elites are blind, Arbiter, but I will make them see.
The Eshram boss fight is set up throughout the entire game, and then all you can take away from it is that Eshram wants to fight Master Chief. And then Eshram fights Master Chief, and he's excited. Let's take a look back at Halo 2. You know what other bosses set up with holograms? Regret. But obviously he's an actual character that does things, but what does he do in the holograms? He recites religion for himself and the Covenant. And that's it. That's already more characterization than Eshram got in the entirety of Halo Infinite. Most of the bosses in Halo Infinite are just shallow cutouts that are like, I'm gonna break your skull, Master Chief, and then I'm gonna eat you. Whereas in Halo 2, it actually felt real and significant. 343 probably put too much of a focus on boss fights to where they actually started formatting the story around them. Nothing about it actually feels like a real war. But then you do have the Harbinger boss fight, which isn't the traditional corny Halo Infinite boss fight.
My bars are clean, my flow's extreme. I heard you slept with the whole football team.
But the problem here is that the Harbinger is a nothing character that's written with no depth at all. How am I supposed to care about a boss fight if I don't care about the character I'm fighting? I think the only boss fight that works narratively is Adjutant Resolution because we naturally understand everything about him. He's a monitor, which means that he's obsessed with protecting the installation. And the writing is also good because I guess 343 just couldn't write villains or something, I don't know. Now when it comes to the actual gameplay of these boss fights, some are good, some are annoying, and that's pretty much it. The boss fights that are essentially just buffed up enemies are pretty normal and don't really take away or add much to the game. I would say Adjutant Resolution and Jaeger are the best boss fights in the game because they have their fun and realized gameplay loops. Adjutant is a good boss fight for a shooter because you actually have to shoot specific areas to do damage. The music in the fight is also pretty good, which ties into the presentation. And then Jaeger's boss fight has this really cool premise where you have to use your ears to know where he's going to expose himself. It's a nice change of pace and it reminds me a lot of Five Nights at Freddy's in a good way. And then Eshram I thought was pretty bland with you just basically running away from him the entire time. Doesn't really feel dynamic at all. And then Harbinger is one of the weirdest boss fights, like I don't even know what 343 envisioned when fighting her. You kind of have to rush her or else she locks on you with these purple high damage projectiles, and she's not very reactive at all to the damage she receives. So ultimately guys, Halo Infinite does have the most realized boss fights in the series. I think they probably are the best, but I do feel like Halo 2's are still more satisfying and impactful. In contrast to popular belief, I don't think 343 really solved anything when it comes to Halo boss fights. They essentially just gave us slightly more dynamic enemies with a visible health bar. So what really is the goal with Halo boss fights? Well, I don't really know. Just kidding guys, I do. The first thing you have to get right is the writing. Now I did probably spend too much of this video talking about narratives and writing, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is for a boss fight. If I don't care about the character, then I'm not going to care about killing them. But let's talk about the actual mechanics now. First of all, you cannot have checkpoints because checkpoints take away from the accomplishment, which is the most important part. If it feels like removing checkpoints would make the boss fight boring and tedious, then you made a bad boss fight. So how do you actually make a good boss fight? Well, in a game like Halo, there's different routes that you could take, but whichever you choose, you have to have dynamic gameplay. The first and most common boss fight is the 1v1 battle. What you shouldn't do here is just have the player run away, turn around, shoot, and then run away again. Look at Warden Eternal. He has a variety of different attacks that the player can actually make reads on and counter effectively. Making the enemy more dynamic makes the gameplay more dynamic, and that is always better. Like imagine if the atriox boss fight just ends up being him rushing you down with a hammer. That would be disappointing beyond belief. So instead, give him a variety of attacks. Some ideas I have are maybe like he forcefully drags the hammer on the ground and sends a shockwave towards you. His hammer swing should be predictable and dodgeable. Maybe he has a charge up attack where he does AoE damage. He should have weak points and be able to be stunned. Like imagine every time you get stunned you can do like an assassination move God of War style. That would be insane, dude. Also, don't be afraid to have dynamic arenas like destroyable cover or moving platforms. And another type of boss fight would be the more experimental boss fights like Jaeger, where he tries to sneak up on you. Maybe you could have a boss fight where you try to sneak up on the enemy. Maybe a more realized version of the Regret boss fight. Maybe there's a boss fight where you have to take out a fire team or something. So in conclusion, you gotta have good narrative weight, good presentation, good difficulty, and dynamic gameplay. Boss fights throughout Halo's history has definitely been interesting to say the least. I think there's good arguments on both sides regarding whether or not Halo should even have boss fights, but if they're gonna have villains, then they have to let the player handle business themselves.